Broadly speaking, the suffragette movement was a group of women who were fighting to get women to vote. So at that time, women couldn't vote in general elections. And obviously a lot of these women were working women, tax-paying women, but they were being denied their right to have a say in the democratic process. And so initially groups of them were formed with men, it was mixed-sex membership, to form suffrage societies, which then eventually led on to the more militant suffragette movement that we're perhaps more familiar with. So in February 1918 the Representation of the People Bill is passed in Parliament, and that gives women aged over 30 the right to vote, but they also have to satisfy a property qualification as well. And then 10 years later, in 1928, we have the Equal Franchise Act. So this gives all men and women aged over 21 the right to vote. In terms of the suffrage campaign in Birmingham, in terms of the constitutional campaign, it's quite significant. It was the third earliest suffrage society to be formed after societies in Manchester and London. So it was seen as quite a significant development that there was a suffrage society in Birmingham, and that happened in 1868.
The majority of the women that when I was out talking to, they tend to say that their husbands always go and vote, and I says, well, why don't you? You're entitled to your vote as well. And they said, oh no, he always goes. I says, whenever he goes, you go with him and you cast your vote too. The ward that I was representing, it was a very marginal, I don't think any of our Labour councillors have actually won that seat. So by me standing there, I actually got majority Asian women out, and we literally just basically on the scheme of it, we won. By women actually that came out.
I think the biggest barrier or kind of annoyance in regards to men and women is the gender stereotypes, the gender binaries that have been attached to women and men in regards to what they should and should not be doing, and that is instilled from a very, very young age, and that starts to categorize you, it starts to typecast you on what you should and shouldn't be doing. So in regards to equality, you know, women wanting to do what stereotypically and historically have been male-oriented jobs, it's very difficult to do that. There has to be a first. We need women to be that first to pierce and break down those barriers, to open the doors for other women.
I've seen it from my background, from my mom's side, from my grandmother's side. As a woman, their voice always down and the men's voice always go up. So if they want to put their opinion, that should be always left behind, and the men's opinion goes always on top. My success was in women involved in politics, especially in my community, Bangladeshi community. There wasn't any woman in Birmingham for mainstream politics. So I was the first person who stand for local council election, and I gained very good vote as well. So my success in there as a woman, I can prove that from my community I can do something in politics. So then other women can follow me later.
So here in Birmingham, for the first time, we have a cabinet that is 50% women, which has never happened before. And of those 50% women, I think it's 40% are BAME women. So that's a huge improvement, but we've still got a long way to go. So that's just when you look at it as just women. But when you look at the other characteristics that we've also got attached to different types of women, so whether it's BAME women, LGBT women, women with disability, when you start going further down the diversity chain, I think there's a lot more work to be done. I don't think organisations are consciously working through that. I think sometimes they think, oh, okay, we've done the women bit, that's fine, we don't need to do anything else. But actually characteristics are more complex, and we will have more additional needs and communities that we are aligned to.
I think Birmingham as a city is doing well, but I think that's because of the multicultural diverse city that Birmingham is. I think it wouldn't it'd be very extremely awkward, uncomfortable and questionable if all our MPs and councillors representing the specific wards within Birmingham were white middle class men.
So when I joined the Cabinet on Birmingham City Council, I was the only woman on it. I was 25 years old at the time, and I was in an environment where pretty much everybody else in the room, apart from the minute taker, was male in every meeting I went into. So it was a very different environment to what we have now, where we, for the first time in Birmingham's history, have a 50-50 representation of men to women on the Cabinet, and we're pretty much the same on the officer team as well. I cannot tell you the difference that that has made, having proper representation in Birmingham. We've gone from a culture where it was incredibly macho, incredibly male-dominated when I started, to somewhere where everyone's perfectly comfortable in the council chamber at our last meeting having a debate about period poverty. We've also had debates on abortion and on domestic violence that I just don't think would have been possible when I first started. And women are the majority users of council services, and we are the majority of employees.
I don't think I really wanted to go into politics because I've always found it, especially in the Asian community, I always found it's like a man's world where women don't tend to go. But because I was quite passionate and I'm a very active person, and I always did find that when we did used to go to our meetings and when we were door knocking and talking to residents having our street stalls, it was always, majority of the time was male dominant, and I always used to find I was always the odd woman there. Women don't really understand is everything that they do, their school runs, their shopping and everything is all linked to politics, and they turn around and say we don't do politics. But officially they do in a way, because everything they do is all politics.
It is so important that women get involved in politics, and particularly women from groups that aren't represented properly at the moment. The council provides services across Birmingham, but the majority of service users are female. The majority of staff are female. If you look at women's position in society, women are far more likely to be reliant on public transport because they don't have the funds to have a car or even to learn to drive in the first place. Women are far more likely to be reliant on state benefits as well. Women are far more likely to be sole carers of children or for elderly people. So the decisions taken by politicians disproportionately affect women time after time, and it is so vitally important that we have women sat around the table making those decisions, because it makes the world of difference as to what gets decided.
So for lots of these women, particularly the sort of affluent ones, or even for working women, you know, they were paying taxes, they were being asked to contribute to society in lots of ways, but then they were being told, but you know, we can't trust you with the vote because you're not intelligent enough and you won't know what to do with it, and the idea that their husband or their father should speak for them. You know, they saw it just as it's their right, isn't it? You know, you have to be part of the democratic process. I think we tend to see it as being a sort of single issue, but it wouldn't have been for them at all. There would have been lots of different issues. So there were some of them were really keen to sort of improve the lives of working women, working class women particularly. Particularly in Birmingham, places like the Cradley Heath chain making, women who were being paid, you know, terrible, like basically slave labour almost, you know.
So my road into politics was sort of a long journey. It initially started many years ago when I was a single mum. I was a homeless teen living within the city, and I'd slept outside McDonald's by the library, which is no longer there, for one night, and that is because I was not that resilient. I then went to St Basil's, who housed me. Got kicked out of one of their projects because I broke the rules. I wasn't the model tenant at all. There was times when we was in the hostel where I made a lot of friends and we had a laugh. And then there was times where it was absolutely difficult. So walking from Moseley to Washford Heath, on a Sunday with my washing to get my clothes washed by my aunt and a Sunday dinner. And actually, when I was in the project in Moseley, my friend Shalina and I fighting over 50 pence because that's all we got. One wanted to buy pop and one wanted to buy a single cigarette. And I think there's fundamental differences for males and females, particularly rough sleep inside of it. So whereas everybody's concern is about safety, a bed to sleep for the night, there's many women that I've met who are rough sleeping, who have lost their children, who their children are in social services, so they have to deal with the emotional trauma from that. Every person that's ever had a period will know that it can be uncomfortable. There are times when it messes with your emotions, for anything like me, and other things. And then on top of thinking of how am I going to feed myself today, they've got to think about how am I going to find sanitary products to be able to keep myself and my hygiene clean.
We need to also target our efforts towards young people, but even younger children, and break down those stereotypes about what young boys should be playing with and what young girls should be playing with within, a school setting or a nursery setting. We need to tackle, in regards to gender equality, tackle the supermarkets and the toy stores that genderize their aisles in regards to the boys' clothes are there and the girls' clothes are there, and the boys' toys are there and the girls' toys are there.
We need to change the way we are dividing us as a male and female. We should understand that we all have equal right. We all need to work together like a friend, and also if like teaching our children, this is the environment we have to work, either is politics or is in media or is in community. Otherwise, children wouldn't understand what is the community and what is, why we are dividing the community with male and female. When I was young, I seen their women didn't go out. They always stay in home. They don't work. They don't go for the job, or they didn't do studies. Even in back home, I seen my mom. She is the first person from my dad's side to start a job, and she accepts many kind of criticism, but she overcome all this situation. So nowadays, yes, myself, I'm in the politics. My sister is working, my family is, everyone is doing businesses and jobs and everything. So yes, it is changed a lot, and hopefully it's going to be changed more.
Being a woman is also extremely difficult because of our perceived and expected caring responsibilities that have been placed upon us. Things like becoming pregnant within the workplace. It's not frowned upon or anything like that. Well, it's not directly frowned upon. However, we already know as women, it sets us back, it pushes us back. You've got to take time off to actually have the baby. Maternity leave, it pushes you back.
Last November, I became Birmingham's second female deputy leader. We've only ever had one female leader as well. So it's a great honour to take that on. And I see my job as being to open the doors to make sure that it's not an anomaly next time there's a woman here. It's just normal and expected. And we've broken down barriers that stop women from getting here. So in May this year, we took a policy through council that introduced maternity rights for councillors for the first time in Birmingham, meaning that next time a woman takes on a role like mine, if they have a child, they won't have to quit their job, which was the case up to May. One of the reasons it took so long for us to get a maternity policy for councillors is because so few women had made it through to senior positions, and particularly young women who might have children. It hadn't really been an issue before. There's been odd cases throughout history, but nothing really that's needed a proper policy. So, and to me that's just as shocking, that reason for not having one is just as shocking as the fact that we didn't have one. So we've currently got our first female councillor off on maternity leave at the moment. She had a little baby last week.
think for women in general it is more difficult because politics can be a predominantly male environment at times. Sometimes depending on the area that you're working in, particularly like I work around housing, sometimes you'll find you're going to meetings and you're the only female in the room, and maybe sometimes your voice gets lost, and sometimes males will over-dominate you and they'll see you as the lady in the corner rather than someone that's on a par as them. But what I will say is that my journey probably hasn't been as hard as some of the others, because as a BAME woman, or a Caribbean woman, African Caribbean woman, I was quite fortunate that there's been a number of women that have led the way. So Councillor Sybil Spence has been a councillor since the 80s. Yvonne Mosquito has been a councillor for a long time. Paulette Hamilton was in cabinet before I was in cabinet. So I feel like there's been a wealth of experience to learn from, people to be guided by, and a lot of wisdom. But saying that, it has been challenging at times, and also trying to push agendas that affect women without men feeling intimidated by it, or that you're trying to sort of really force your opinions on them, and there are subtle ways in doing that. So this is the corridor where all the pictures of the Lord Mayors are, and as you can see, the first female Lord Mayor was Mrs. Marjorie Alice Brown in 1973 to 1974. And then there was another one in 1977, which is Frida Cox. And the first Caribbean Lord Mayor was Councillor Sybil Spence in 1997 to 1998. And then we have a range from Sue Anderson, Councillor Teresa Stewart, who was the leader of the council at some point, Anita Ward more recently. And then now, last year's Lord Mayor was Anne Underwood, and this year, 20 years on from Sybil Spence, we have Yvonne Mosquito.
In academic spaces, within conferences, within meetings, I'm often one of the only black women, if not, BAME people, so my minority ethnic people in the room. That is very difficult to have to deal with, basically. I'm not going to scream and shout about it because that is just what it is, but I'm very aware of my position, I'm very aware of my presence, but I'm also very aware of who is not in the room, and sometimes that creates a barrier because then I'm wary of what I say. I filter a lot of what I say because I'm trying to, which is weird, fit in. It doesn't matter if I do have good credentials on paper, my gender is a barrier to me getting to where I want to get to, and then my ethnicity is like a stoppage point in regards to my gender would get me so far, but I know if I want those higher positions, like to become a professor or a head of department or a reader in political science, I can see my ethnicity being a blockage, a stop point. It's just not going to happen.
There's often occasions where people think it's okay to shout at you in ways that they wouldn't necessarily shout at a male counterpart. The perception of it's okay, dear, or that you should only really be speaking on, or you've only got credibility speaking on issues that predominantly affect women. So if you're talking about domestic violence, or you're talking about any form of abuse around women, they think that your voice is credible. If you're talking around something that's on an issue that is more in a male-dominated arena, sometimes they don't listen to you or treat you as you're as credible. So if I was to speak on something like the economic growth of the city, they would take it more seriously if it was coming from one of the male cabinet members.
I think my biggest struggle at the moment is what I research, which is masculinity, which I find quite comical that my research topic is a barrier for me entering into politics, you know, and it's quite prehistoric to think that women can't research masculinity and men can't research femininity and so on and so forth. And there we go again with the gender and the stereotypes, and what I should be researching is women basically, and even more specifically black women. And I think we need to get rid of that. So that's a barrier for me at the moment, and I'm piercing through that. If I go to a conference, I kind of get a glare, or if I speak to academics, I often get a little look like, you do know you're a woman, don't you? And I'm thinking in my head, yes, I'm very aware that I'm a woman. Thank you for acknowledging.
So on Birmingham City Council, we're now up to 1 in 3 councillors being female. It's a massive step forward, but nowhere near enough. And we are still lagging behind in terms of ethnic minority women as well. So there's been some really interesting research done by the Fawcett Society in particular about the barriers women face in taking up elected office. And women who are from BAME backgrounds, of course, have additional barriers over and above what white women like myself might have. So we took a piece of work through Council in December, doing an audit against all of the recommendations from that Fawcett Society report, looking at how we're addressing barriers to women getting elected. What I want to do next year is do another piece of work looking at in particular BAME women and LGBT and disabled people as well, and looking at how we start breaking down those barriers too.
So I think that in terms of the suffrage campaign, it's, you know, we should always remember that they're not trying to get the votes for all women. They're getting the votes for some women who can satisfy property qualification. So I think they see it in steps, and I think it's really unfortunate that they would have seen, they potentially, not all of them, but they potentially would have seen black and Asian women, you know, almost being at the bottom of that pile. I read recently that obviously in New Zealand it was one of the earliest countries to give women the vote in 1893, and I haven't seen the sort of article properly, but I think I read a reference that Millicent Fawcett, who was in charge of the National Union of Suffrage Societies, would have not been pleased that Maori women could vote before white English women could vote. So I think we've got to be mindful that that it is in that kind of colonial context, and that there were attitudes then that obviously we would feel very uncomfortable with now.
Shall we? I'll do get next to it. Yeah, okay. No problem. I'll go for the show. I promise this year I'm not going to wait about it. Yeah.
Now approaching London Euston, our final destination. I'd just like to wish everyone on board a very, very good rest of the day. Thank you.
And I'm sure you faced abuse, and you were so resilient. There are so many girls that aren't.
Hi, I'm Gina Martin, and I'm at a panel at Westminster to celebrate 100 years since women were allowed to stand for Parliament. I'm speaking today because I started a campaign to make upskirting sexual events in the UK, and I was speaking on the importance of getting involved in politics because I don't have a political background or law background, and I think everyone kind of assumes you have to stand as an MP to get involved in politics, and that's just not the truth. It's wonderful if you do. We need far more women in politics than we have, but there are multiple ways that you can get involved. I started a social media campaign and brought it to Parliament and forced them to change the law that way. There's not enough women in politics at the moment. There hasn't been since politics began. There's a lot more that we need to do to ensure that there's as many women as there are men, that we reflect society outside, but also to make sure that we have every type of woman from every type of background, every type of race, every type of gender, because issues are front of mind for the people that experience them. So you need to make sure you are reflecting exactly who is walking the street so that you can come up with solutions to make their life easier.
What you said about not making it,
and I'd be really grateful if you could just sum up everything in about 3 main points that you've discussed on your table.
It was just like, here you come, you're going to have a conversation, a debate about it, but there was no action to it, or there was no end result to why we're having this conversation about women empowerment and women in politics. I'd say it is quite tough, especially when you don't really have someone you can aspire to, or even someone where you know, oh, their journey has worked out, or this is what they're doing. Because if you do look in politics, there's a very small minority, very small minority of ethnic women in politics. So it's quite nerve-wracking, to be fair, to be like, oh, I want to go into politics when you know it's going to be a tough road ahead.
There's a really big job that white women need to do to be better allies and to help platform women of different backgrounds and minorities into those spaces. And there's a lot of work we need to be doing about representation, just to be able to show young women of all different backgrounds that they can do that, because you can't be what you can't see. So if there's no women in politics that look like you automatically assume growing up that's not an option.
There's barriers in terms of my own confidence and stuff, and I think that's something I'm going to work on. And this event's really helped.
I think some of the biggest gender equality issues that we face in modern society are structural. So it's about institutionalised arenas. You'll find the glass ceiling when we get to a certain level when it comes to leadership particularly, and the hierarchy. And it's about having or challenging a cultural dominance within organisations for them to be more conscious of gender balance and the things that affect women. If we're going to have real gender equality and readdress the balance, then we have to have men who are conscious of that as well. So their behaviours towards women, it's not, hello Mr such and such and the lady over there, it's actually treating us like we are also equals. So I've seen literature where what has been said about a male counterpart who's said exactly the same thing as a female, there's a slight difference, and then there's a further difference if it was a BAME female. So sometimes absolutely our voices get lost a lot more, the way that we can be treated, how people take us seriously. And if you listen to the dialogue when we're asked questions, particularly from the cabinet members, there's absolutely been instances where females have been shouted at, questioned longer, been treated in a way that was slightly inappropriately, comments that are fly on the wall, comments that come back, that you wouldn't say that to a male.
Sadly, I have been the recipient of some negative attitudes, thanks to being a woman here. When I first started on the council, it was much worse than it is now, and I think that's because representation has improved so much during my time here. So when I first started, the rumour was put around that I was sleeping with the male leader of the council. I was mistaken for officers' wives, or an officer's wife, at various events I went to, which was particularly impressive because there was a 30-year age gap in one case. I would get pretty frequent comments in the corridor about what I was wearing, which, as you could probably see from what I'm wearing, doesn't tend to be all that daring, but yet that's still enough to attract comments on a not irregular basis. Women from BAME backgrounds no doubt have it harder than I do. So I have witnessed on the council one of my colleagues, who is a black woman, having a particularly vitriolic campaign against her in her ward, where there are particular racial tensions there in a way that I just haven't witnessed happening anywhere else. I have another female colleague, she's from a Pakistani background. She's been incredibly ill recently and hasn't been able to attend meetings. The vitriol that has been levelled at her has been so much over and above what I've seen levelled at men who haven't been able to attend meetings for far less legitimate reasons.
In other community, there is a woman, 2 times is running MPs, many times is running councillor. Why is no woman from our community? This is the question. And it is a harder only reason because why there is no one and there is a new one come and new one will struggle a lot. Only reason she's not going to get enough support.
I think it's even harder to get your voice heard if you're from a minority ethnic background. So yes, I think when you look back at the suffrage campaign, you can see that things took a long time to change, but eventually they did. But actually, when you look back at it, you think, well, it's 100 years, 90 years since all women and men had the vote on the same basis, and actually there's so much more left to do. So in some ways you can sort of take encouragement from the fact that they didn't give up and they kept fighting, and of course we should do that as well. But I can see that there's a sense of, impatience that actually we should be much further on than we are now.
One of the biggest barriers initially is accessibility and opportunity. I think politics, to be able to kind of get into that field, it's usually through a gatekeeper, so you know somebody or you have somebody in your family or like a teacher that's kind of inspired you politically to go down that path. People from minority groups or ethnic minorities or minorities in regards to other intersections may not have that gatekeeper or may not have the access to that pathway. The current representation of politics within the UK, the political parties, our MPs, what do they look like? Do they look like you? And therefore barriers are put in place because it's very difficult to see an institution that's been there, for decades, for centuries, start to look different, and a lot of people feel a bit uncomfortable like that, and there may be resistance in place, but I think all the change and the resistance are part of a barrier for minorities to pierce into politics or to become involved in politics.
Nationally, there are those stories of women from LGBT or disabled or minority groups. There are a few cases. So there was one woman, Rosa May Billinghurst, who used, it's not a wheelchair, but it's a kind of device, because she couldn't walk very well. LGBT, yeah, there's certainly, I haven't looked into that personally, but there have been stories of some of the suffragettes particularly being in lesbian relationships that have then turned out not to be true, but there are certainly some cases that I think there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that women were having those relationships. In terms of minority groups, that's really difficult to look into. Often the people refer to Princess Sophia Singh Duleep. She was a sort of Indian princess living in London, became involved in the campaign. She was related to Queen Victoria. So people sort of point to her, but she's clearly from a particular background.
You cannot assume someone's sexuality. That would be absolutely ridiculous to do so. It'd be quite funny to see how incorrect you are, but you cannot assume who is anything anymore. I think that the only thing that people try and do is acknowledge ethnicity, because that's one thing you cannot hide, sort of, because then you cannot tell the nationality of somebody. You may look at somebody and say, well, they're white, but then white what? Like that's just a colour. You need a little bit more than that to start looking at representation. The same with black, the same with Asian, the same with so on. When you say Asian, that's just such a mass term. That is, a post-colonial Orientalist term to just typecast a certain part of the globe to say Asian. Even in the same with black, where are we talking about geographically? What culture are we talking about? So yeah, the same can be said to so many different intersections, but I would say the only one that you can try and visually understand and start to assume on is ethnicity, but in regards to disability, sexuality, even someone's gender, you know, you cannot tell somebody their gender, it's what they identify as. All these things would need to be, that data needs to be collected confidentially, and then see what you can do with that in regards to representation.
When it comes to LGBT representation, we are underrepresented on the council. We also have incredibly poor data collection, particularly amongst our staff, as to how many of our staff are from LGBT groups. And to me, that is a very worrying signal, because it shows that a lot of people aren't comfortable disclosing that and don't feel like it's a safe environment to. So we particularly need to address that so that we can open doors and address the other problems.
I think disability is interesting, and the term itself has been, I believe, hijacked by policy and by funding and by people that are using it to get and gain something, because what people want to see in politics, which is really unfortunate, is those visible disabilities. They want to see an MP in a wheelchair. They want to see an MP with either a missing limb or a physical or visible disability. But we know, you know, I have a disability, and I'm absolutely fine to disclose I have multiple sclerosis. Today's a good day, sort of. But my disability on some days is hidden, on other days is very visible. And I think that when we look at representation of disability in politics, we need to remember that not all disability is visible. There's people with conditions that, you know, it's internal, you cannot see it, but every day they're taking tablets, or every day they're having to, you know, go through a routine to help them keep mobile or become an active member of that society for the day. There's also people with disabilities like mental health disabilities, which you cannot visually see. It's in somebody's mind or their personality. So I think in regards to politics and disability, I probably could and quite easily argue that, you know, politics is not doing very well, or, you know, it's not very representational. However, it's very hard to comment on, because unless somebody also has disclosed or identified themselves of having a disability, you can't say that politics isn't representational.
I think we do have a long way to go, still with LGBT and disabled representation in particular. For people with disabilities, the sheer physical process involved to become a councillor, having to go out leafleting, door knocking, attending meetings quite often late into the night, long days where it's often difficult to eat. Those physical challenges, they're hard enough if you're able-bodied. If you have a disability on top of that, that can make it very, very difficult simply to get through the process to be here. So I think there are questions we need to ask about our expectation of candidates, even before they become councillors. And we seriously need to look at how we make it possible for people with a disability to get ahead.
I haven't ever directly experienced someone discriminating against me because of a disability, but things that have been put in place, like the times of meetings, where the meeting is, like, for example, the location, the types of chairs in the room, the agenda on the meeting, I feel like at no point has anybody who set up this meeting thought there may be somebody in the room that cannot climb those stairs and there's no lift, or there's, you know, there may be someone in the room that cannot keep going for 2 hours straight, and we should have put a break in the middle.
For this year, we've been celebrating the centenary of women getting the vote, and I became aware of an incredible Birmingham woman called Bertha Ryland. And what she did was, she was a suffragette, and she left her family one day and she went to the Museum and Art Gallery, just next door to the council house. And in protest at women not having the vote, she slashed a painting. And it's a simple act of defiance, but after she did that, she was taken and held for several months, and she was essentially tortured by her own government. They force-fed her. She had undiagnosed health problems, and it led to her being permanently disabled for the rest of her life and living in pain for all of those years. She went through all of that torture and disablement from her own country as a result of that simple act of slashing a painting in protest at not having a voice in her society. And hearing her story, as we've uncovered it this year, and hearing that massive sacrifice that she made in the very building that I work in, really was quite humbling for me, actually, because of huge sacrifices like that I think have gone too often unrecognised. I'm able to sit here and represent people in Birmingham in a way that was just unimaginable for her. So right now, she's my personal hero.
The suffragette movement itself began in 1903 with the formation of the Women's Social and Political Union in Manchester, and then of course it spread across the country. In terms of Birmingham itself, there's lots of significant things that happened. There was a big demonstration in 1909 at the old Bingley Hall, which is now the Convention Centre, where the Prime Minister had come to the city to talk to a number of Liberal Party members. It was disrupted by suffragettes, who just a small group actually of 10 women, who disrupted what was happening outside, and they were faced with lots of police there on duty that night. But what that resulted in was the women being arrested, imprisoned, and then going on hunger strike. And the decision made between Winson Green Prison and the Home Office to then forcibly feed the women. So obviously that's quite a significant development in terms of the campaign, and then that signals the sort of beginning of 5 years of women who are in and out of prison and being repeatedly forcibly fed. In terms of other sort of militant actions that took place, there was a library burnt down, so I think this is the only incident of a library arson which took place in 1914, so really at the peak of the militant activity. And that was a library in Northfield that it was a Carnegie library, so it's quite interesting to perhaps consider why they chose that particular type of institution to attack. There was also an attempt to blow up part of the canal, which didn't succeed, but had it succeeded, it would potentially have caused serious injuries, if not death. Actually, it was quite serious. And there were lots of the sort of things that we see happening around the country happened in Birmingham. So there were false fire alarms, window smashing, post boxes being set on fire, attempted explosions, arson attacks. In Birmingham as well, the cathedral was attacked. So again in 1914, a group of women had sort of hidden away in the cathedral on a Saturday evening, and when the members of the congregation went to the cathedral the next day, they found that the inside had been completely covered in painted slogans protesting not only against women not having the right to vote, but really against the church's refusal to condemn the government and the forcible feeding that was taking place fairly intensely by that point. There was a woman called Hilda Burkett, so she was involved in the campaign in Birmingham for a few years but then moved away. But she was one of the first, the group of 10 women who were forcibly fed at Winson Green Prison, and she went on to become an itinerant suffragette. So she travelled around the country, was involved in all sorts of militancy, and she was forcibly fed over 200 times over a 5-year period because she was in and out of prison. So in terms of the constitutional campaign, it was led for many years by a woman called Catherine Osler. So her parents had actually established a society in 1868. She was 14 at the time, and she subscribed then and was always a subscriber. Eventually she became the secretary, and then later she became the president, and she was the president for over 20 years. So she's really significant, but she's one of these people that, because she's part of the constitutional campaign, we're less familiar with them. They're not in the newspapers as often.
This is the Ellen Pinsent room at Birmingham City Council House. Ellen Pinsent was the first female councillor on Birmingham City Council, and to celebrate the centenary of the first women getting the vote, we thought we would rename the rather drab Committee Room 1 after one of our first female pioneers. We've got here Catherine Osler, who was a suffragist and incredibly important in the fight for women's equality in Birmingham. So this is Louisa Ryland. Louisa Ryland inherited a large sum of money from her parents back in the 19th century, and what she chose to do, rather than keep it, was donate it to the people of Birmingham piece by piece. And you will see parks and buildings across the city that are part of that legacy that she left for Birmingham. So to mark the centenary of the first women getting the vote, we commissioned a commemorative photograph of all of the sitting female councillors at the time, and a number of former councillors as well. And we also had a photograph taken of all of the living former female Lord Mayors of the city. And there have only ever been 8 female Lord Mayors in more than 100 years of women of Birmingham having a Lord Mayoralty. We also have a photograph of Dame Ellen Pinsent herself in the room, very kindly donated by her family. And this is a photograph from the days when, as a young woman, she was a councillor here, and she focused her work particularly on mental health and people with learning disabilities as well, which was really quite pioneering at the time.
If a young woman came to me and asked me and said, you know, what's my advice on getting into politics, the first thing I always ask is, why? Why do you want to get into politics? Because I think your why is a clear indication of whether it's for you. And the second thing that I always say is, what is your actual interest? Because politics streams through everything in life, from the clothes that we wear, you know, there's a bit of politics in there in terms of taxation, and so it's in every area. So I always ask, what is it that you're into? So my thing was, I was very passionate about homelessness. Some females say they're very passionate about women's rights and equality. So I always use that as a starting point, and then say, actually, this is then what you start to build on. Because if you focus on something, we're not jack of all trades, if you focus on something you're particularly passionate about, that's where you can make a real difference.
Some of the struggles, you could probably say, was sort of getting their voices heard. And I think that's one of the reasons that the militant campaign came about, really, because for people like the Pankhursts, they had seen these women who, you know, people like Millicent Fawcett, who had sort of quietly sat for 30 years writing letters and trying to force the issue but never really getting anywhere. And so one of the first things Emmeline Pankhurst does is goes and stands outside Parliament and shouts loudly.
So why don't you speak to all of us?
Sitting here with one person or with sitting?
Okay, so do I go through on which line?
I don't have a meeting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. I don't have meetings with no president. I'm sitting here with one person.
Yeah, it's a bit more than you expected, but like, we're a union, right? So we don't negotiate on an individual level. We're not here, we all want to hear what you say.
Not happening.
There's one over there as well with your phone.
Do you want to talk to these folks over here?
Yes, I was going to say, because...
Hey Andrew, we've been told your house is full of mold. Hey Andrew! Hey Andrew!
Hey Andrew, we've been told that your house is full of mold. Hey Andrew! Hey Andrew!
Today we were doing a picket against my landlord at his job, because he's been a very poor landlord, and running a supportive housing place, which is not proper supportive housing, and to put supportive housing, fire exits are blocked, there's massive amounts of mold in my room in particular, and I have like a health condition which he knew about, and he didn't care, and he knew about the mold the whole time. So it's built up to you know, this because he didn't care.
If we could help.
Yeah,
Would you mind not taking photos, please?
So basically, a couple of members of staff from the building who work for the landlord, Andrew, just came down and asked us what was going on. We described the situation to him, basically, that he came down, refused to talk to us.
Ran away.
And ran away. Because, and they said, oh, why has that happened? We basically explained that there's more of us than he was expecting, but that we negotiated, we offered to meet him with less people, but he still refused.
He refused.
Yep. So they asked us if we can not. What we've been doing is just talking to people as they're coming in and out of the building to let them know what's going on, that there is this landlord operating in the building who's a slum landlord and has refused to meet us. And one of those people has just gone and talked to the front desk, basically.
They're going to try and call Andrew again.
Yeah.
So we've said that we're not going to leave until Andrew comes to meet us, and we're going to tell everyone in the building that he's a slum landlord and that he's expecting people to live in damp and mouldy homes, and when people challenge him on that, he runs away.
But he refused to talk to us. If you like, it's just a little leaflet about who we are, what we do. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, if you want to...
Excuse me, I understand you've got a problem and a protest, but these people are just trying to come into a building.
That's what I'm saying. No.
Well, they probably don't want to know.
Are you...
No, they're trying to go in.
You've just been told you can't film.
Can you leave, please?
Actually, I've got a load of
That's the offer for him to be with me and
I feel like especially if you're a woman and you have a light voice, people don't want to take you seriously. So sometimes I'll call the place and, you know, I'll get like nowhere with them, even though like I'm telling them like serious stuff. And then like my boyfriend, which he's helped me a lot, he will call and he will get a totally different response.
So thanks so much, but yeah, it's not right, mate. Like, it's not right living with mould. Mate, it's not right. Thanks for talking anyway, yeah.
Yeah, the CPU is...
on the table. So he said if the tenancy ends today, he's going to write off all your debt.
So like all of that bullshit amount that he said, like...
The government doesn't care about the community. Maybe certain people that work for the government, but like the government as a whole are not known to care about, especially like people that are not in good wealth or good education. So if you know that you could pair up with your community, which understand we're all human, let's help each other, then that's really good.
The Representation of the People Act is passed in February 1918, so women over the age of 30 will now be able to vote in general elections. Later on in 1918 there's another kind of bill passed which allows women aged over 21 to run for Parliament. So they can't vote, but they can run for Parliament, which just seems very bizarre to us now. And one of the women who was put forward to run for Parliament was Christabel Pankhurst, the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, so senior, well, basically WSPU leader. She'd been in Paris prior to the war and then had to come back. And it's decided that she will try and run for Parliament, and they look for a seat that she could run for. So I think they look originally at somewhere down in the southwest, but eventually it's decided that she'll run for the constituency of Smethwick, which is just outside Birmingham. And actually, she comes really close to winning. So I think she loses out, I think it's about 500 or 600 votes, so she comes really close to actually winning that. And I think and the argument is that had women aged over the age of 21 been allowed to vote, it's quite possible that she would have been elected, because there would have been a lot of women that would have remembered her from the campaign and stuff and would have been quite keen for her to become an MP.
It's definitely getting better. Maybe I'm just getting older. But the comments have definitely got less over the years. And I think it's partly because we call them out on it. So I wrote an article for The Guardian a couple of years ago that called out an awful lot of this, and I have to say a lot of it dropped off overnight actually once people realised that I was prepared to go out and say about this. There have been other councillors other particularly female councillors who have had an awful time, and they've also been brave enough to call it out. And when you do that, it's a really hard thing to do because you don't know what the repercussions are going to be. But my experience, it makes such a difference. It shames people. You don't even have to name them. Just calling out the behaviour, even if you don't name people, shames them into stopping.
Also, if you look at instances where women have been trolled, who are in politics, the way that we're treated when we're being trolled is usually a lot more horrific in comparison to what males would get. So very often if you hear of a male being trolled, it'll just be, the usual forms of abuse. If a woman's being trolled, it will be things like, it's not been uncommon for people to be told that you deserve to be raped, or your children's heads deserve to be taken off, or that you're a slag or something like that, which would be less acceptable as if it was a male. And then also I've seen instances where women who have been elected into a political office, and actually their husbands have been congratulated, oh well done, good for you for supporting her. But actually if a male had took political office, nobody would have batted an eyelid at his wife who's looking after the kids, but because a man is, it's kind of really widely celebrated.
So there was quite an interesting article that appeared in the newspapers in 1914 after the cathedral attack by this anonymous group who write to the newspaper and say, we've had enough of what the suffragettes are up to, this is how we're going to deal with them. And it's really shocking, it's things like we're going to tar and feather them, we're going to scar them, we're going to attack their premises. So it's really quite sinister, and it's almost, I guess we would refer to it today as trolling, the kinds of abuse that women face on social media.
First of all, I found many struggle from the men-dominated society, which they never want me to go for the election. And only reason, because this is the reason there is no women into the Birmingham from our community. I found when I was a candidate, I found many threats, many kind of harassment texts or calls, and many kind of emails. So this was like a very scary things. Every night I used to go to bed with the tear eyes. When I seen in the morning again there is a sunshine outside, I feel like I have got strength, and I get out and start my activities. So every day was like that, but still I overcome all this situation. The experience I gained from threatening behavior, yes, sometimes it's pulled me out. Sometimes I feel like I don't want to do the politics again because it's affecting in my families, because I'm getting depressed, so I couldn't look after the family properly. And then the day after I realized I'm a woman and I'm the first woman in here. If I don't fight with that situation, probably there is no other woman who will come forward. So as a woman, I believe that no, I have to go forward for the other women. So I want to be a role model on this situation, and I did, yes.
You need to give a truthful account of history, and you don't need to be ashamed about your history, but let's give somebody an actual history lesson and not a side of history that makes someone look great and someone look extremely poor and impoverished and so on and so forth. When it comes to women specifically, I think we need to home in on where were women in history, and if that means women were subjectified, if women were exploited, we need to say that so that we can show the distance that women have travelled to become where they are now. But at the moment, women are kind of, they're vanished in history, or they're silenced, or their presence has been ignored.
I often, people just look at me and just think I'm a Jamaican woman, where actually I've got no Jamaican blood in me whatsoever. My family came from St Kitts. So it's that kind of education around the more intricate details around different communities and how we all connect. But I do think there's an absolute need for more education around BAME women, especially those in history. It's unfortunate that we only ever get to do it around Black History Month. And one of the things, since being a councillor, I absolutely challenged the museum on, and I got a group to work with the museum around putting on displays around the African Caribbean culture and actually putting on an exhibition. And the automatic default was to pull out artifacts that were connected to slavery and the slave trade. And I was like, no, sorry, we contributed a lot more to the UK society other than, and the modern society, we created a lot more towards society other than sort of our history is not just slavery.
So often you're met with the attitude that, it's the men who did this stuff, so it's the men we recognise. Women have been doing this stuff too. It was just most of the time no one's noticed. I remember being at school and asking my history teacher if Mary Seacole might come up in our exam about Florence Nightingale and co, and he shrugged and said, who? She was a black woman who was just as influential as the white Florence Nightingale at the time, and strangely got written out of the history books until remarkably recently. And I'm pretty sure every school child will have a story like that where they know that somebody they recognise is simply just not being included in the way that they should have been. So we've got a long way to go, I think, in terms of getting that recognition. But it's digging out those stories, it's finding those stories, and it's also adjusting our idea of what is important as well. So often it's big battles that are led by men and big inventions that are being created by men that make the history books, but there's so much other social change and so many other contributions that women have made that simply haven't been recognised because we don't recognise those topics as being important enough.
I think there needs to be more teaching around the contributions that we've made to society, and not just in things that are deemed to be more feminine roles, but actually to science, to construction, to politics and all different arenas.
The council looks like an ivory tower, but it's not. You don't need a deposit to stand. You don't need any particular qualifications to stand. I've got colleagues who, I was born into a council house. My parents are NHS nurses. I've got colleagues who were kicked out of school at 15. I've got another colleague who was a teenage mother. We've got people who've been through the army. We've got people who have been in prison. You name it, we've got councillors who have been there and done it. There is no disqualification. It's not just for, it's not for white old men, it's not for posh people, it's for the people of Birmingham.
We have a voice and a responsibility to challenge things that we see as wrong. So I think sometimes we can be very apprehensive about doing that and actually doing it in a way that doesn't intimidate others, but actually a way that influences change. And I think in some regards, there's also women can be barriers to women when it comes to equality, and it's about those that reach different platforms and do different things, that we actually are ambassadors and we don't just pull up the ladder behind us, and actually we decide to actually encourage more people, mentor people, support people through the process, not be afraid to voice our opinion and challenge things that ultimately are affecting women. And the other thing is about not being afraid to be yourself. So if you're working in a male-dominant arena, you don't necessarily need to lose your feminism as a woman or lose your feminine energy as a woman and sort of man up to fit into that arena. You should be bringing yourself and your authentic self.
The politicians answer to us, and I think the suffragettes saw that. And it was really interesting listening to the interview by Maud Smith, who at that time was sort of in her 80s or 90s, and she said, she ends her interview by saying, you must vote. And obviously here was a woman who had physically suffered for that right. So I think it's something that we should never take for granted, and certainly they didn't, and they saw the importance of it and the significance of having representatives that would talk for them, that would talk for women's rights, whether it's in the workplace or at home.
If they don't realise what other women suffered and what they went through, and they're wasting a vote, then that's a point of a waste of life. So that's why we're trying to encourage women to understand. So it's brilliant if we explain the history to them and they can say, you know what, I've got a perfectly good vote here and I'm not using it. Why am I not using it?
The freedoms that we have now as women are so precious and so hard won. The floor that I'm sitting on now, the roof I'm underneath, when they built this, women didn't have any of the rights that we enjoy today. It's so precious and it can so easily be taken away.
I think sometimes we just have to find and fine-tune our position of influence. Some people's position of influence include a placard, include lobbying, include doing the activism, and there's an absolute role for that. Some people are positioned within positions of influence and decision making, like being a politician, and I think we have a role within that. And then some people, they're not going to do the sort of activist, they're not going to be a politician because that does not float their boat. But as a female going into the workplace, they can absolutely put their best foot forward and show in a modern society how we can contribute and be as good as men. So I think in terms of feminism, we all have a role to play in it. And for me, it is like a jigsaw puzzle. We have just different levels of interest in the fight and use our voice, our feet, ourselves in very different ways.
If women try, they can do anything.